Hey, what's up everybody? It's Rutech. Today we'll be talking about the best upgradable $800 gaming PC that you can build in 2022. Now before we get right into it, I do want to clear one quick thing up about this computer. You may have noticed, if you scroll down into the description, that this is an $800 PC rocking a 6500 XT, and let me tell you why. This PC is meant to be highly upgradable and ready when you decide to upgrade to the brand new RTX 4000 series or RX 7000 series GPUs. So to do that, I put a great CPU, a fantastic CPU cooler, great motherboard, lots of storage, which didn't leave a lot of room in the budget for a super strong GPU. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is this computer will be completely ready when you decide to go ahead and upgrade to one of the newer graphics cards, and you won't have to worry about any bottleneck or further upgrades to make up for the performance jump. Now with that out of the way, let's get to the build. All right, let's get started. As usual, the first part we're going to take a look at is the motherboard. In this build, we're using the Gigabyte B550 Gaming X V2. Now, what's a little weird about this motherboard is it says it's Ryzen 5000 series ready on the box, which isn't true. We actually do have to update the BIOS so that it works with our Ryzen 5500. So take the motherboard out of its anti-static bag and place it on top of its box or anything that isn't conductive. So now we're gonna update the BIOS. Plug a USB drive into a spare computer you have, head over to the Gigabyte support website for this particular motherboard, the link will be in the description, and download the file for the latest BIOS version. Click and drag that file into the USB drive and extract the files from the zipped folder. Now you wanna make sure that the only file that's in this USB drive is that weirdly named file right there, the B550 GXV.15D. Delete every other file except for that one. And when that's done, we're gonna rename the file to something a little more normal. In all caps, gigabyte.bin. Once that's finished, you can go ahead and remove the drive. And now we're gonna unbox the power supply, the EVGA 500 or 600 BQ, depending on how powerful you want your future parts to be. We will be needing the power supply in order to flash the BIOS. Coming out of the power supply will be two connectors. The first one we're going to plug into the motherboard is this big 24-pin connector. It plugs into the right side of the motherboard. And the second cable will be the CPU power connector. This plugs into the top left corner of the motherboard. Next, plug in and turn on the power supply. Now go ahead and take that USB drive and plug it into this exact USB port, the one that's white. Then press the Q flash button and wait until the red light stops flashing. When it stops flashing, unplug the USB drive and power supply from the motherboard. And now that the BIOS is updated, we can continue building the computer. The first part we're gonna install on the motherboard is the processor, the Ryzen 5500. This is a fantastic processor for not just gaming, but also all of your productivity software needs. Be careful when removing the processor from its plastic case, then push and release the CPU retention lever, locate the golden triangle on the CPU and match it up with the triangle printed out on the motherboard. Then you can very slowly and gently place the CPU into its socket and then put the lever back in its original position. Now it's time for the memory, the Team T-Force Vulcan Z 16 GB of 3000 MHz RAM. Push down the RAM retention clips of the second and fourth slots, and then preferably using your thumbs, apply pressure to both sides of the RAM sticks until they audibly click into place. After that comes the storage, the crucial P2 1TB of NVMe SSD storage. Use a smaller Phillips head screwdriver to remove this tiny screw on the left, then slide the drive into its slot, and then refasten the tiny screw into its original position, securing the SSD into place. And at this point, we have the RAM, CPU, and storage installed. Now it's time for the CPU cooler. We're going to want to remove these two brackets on the top and bottom of the CPU socket. So to do that, as you might have guessed, you remove the 4 screws holding them in place. To cool the Ryzen 5500, we're going to be using Deepcool's brand new AK400 CPU cooler. Deepcool has lately been releasing some pretty great stuff. They completely changed their design scheme and design language, and I'm all for it. It looks great. Anyway, in that box, you're gonna find this bag. We're not gonna be using all of these parts, only a select few, being these. First, we're going to install those hexagonal orange spacers, and to install these, all you really have to do is just place them on top of the CPU bracket screw holes. You don't need to twist or fasten them or anything, you kind of just plop them on there. Then you can place this metal bracket on top of those spacers, and then fasten it using these 4 screws. Now before we install the cooler here, we do have to remove the fan, and to do that, just pull on these metal braces and the fan will come right off. This cooler does come with pre-applied thermal paste, so that makes things a little bit easier. Remove this plastic cover here. Be careful not to touch the thermal paste, and if you did, you'll be okay. I've done it like a quadrillion times. As long as you didn't take off like a huge chunk, you'll be okay. But yeah, lower the cooler into its position, lining up the spring-loaded screws with the screw mounts. And then you'll want to alternate when fastening these 2 screws, and what I mean by that is go back and forth, and this makes sure that the thermal paste is evenly spread out. And then install the fan back into its original position by pushing these braces into the inlets on the heatsink. Coming out of that fan will be a little wire with a 4-pin connector at the end. That'll plug into this gray header here labeled CPU fan. Now we're gonna start putting stuff in the case. I chose out the Deepcool CK500. It's a pretty great case, especially because it comes with 2 140mm fans included. That's a lot of included airflow. Now if you flip the case around, you'll find this little baggie here that'll have a lot of essential screws that we'll need later on, so do have this on hand. This EVGA BQ500 is a semi-modular power supply, so you will have to plug a few things in, being the VGA cable and the SATA cable. For the VGA cable, make sure you're plugging in the side that is one solid piece. You'll also want to plug in the SATA cable. I forgot to film that part because I'm just a genius, but yeah, do make sure you also plug in the SATA cable. Now we're going to put the power supply in the case. Do make sure the fan is facing downwards. And using the 4 screws that came included in the power supply box, we're going to fasten the power supply into place. Now we're going to remove this rear exhaust fan, and that's because we're going to relocate it to the front. And you'll see why in a bit. It will make this PC look a lot better. Remove the front panel as well as the mesh behind it. Now before we can relocate this fan, we first have to shift this fan down just a little bit to make room for it. Once that's done, reinstall the fan with the wire coming out of the right side. Reason being, these cables are actually pretty short and we want to make sure the wire reaches the fan hub that we're going to install later. With that done, you can reinstall the mesh and front panel. Now it's time to put the motherboard inside of the case, ensure that the I/O panel is lined up with its cutout. Now we're going to screw the motherboard into place. You're going to want to use these screws, which you can find in the bag that came with the case. On the top right of your screen, you can see a diagram that shows you where all of these screws go. Now it's time to install the fans, the Deepcool FC120s. Now you're going to want to be very particular with how you install these. Install this first fan in this exact orientation, logo facing downwards and cable facing the right side of the case. And to fasten it, you'll use the screws that came included with the box. The cable that's coming out of this fan, you'll want to plug into the next Deepcool exhaust fan. Then, once again, install the fan with the Deepcool logo facing downwards. And the reason you're supposed to install them in this exact orientation is because these fans are responsible for pushing the hot air out of the case. Anyway, last FC120 fan, same procedure. Take that cable that's coming out of that last fan, plug it into this one, and install it with the Deepcool logo facing the CPU cooler. And with the cable that's coming out of that fan, you'll want to route to the back of the case using this upper left cutout. Now locate this cable which came with your FC120s. Take off the twisty tie and locate this male connector here. This will be connecting to that cable that's coming out of the fan that we just installed. On the other end of this cable, you'll find these 2 connectors. These will be routing through the bottom right cutout. This 4-pin female connector is going to plug into this header right here labeled system fan. And the 3-pin female connector will plug in here, which is labeled DLED1. Attached to that same cable will be this male SATA connector. This will connect to the SATA power cable coming out of the power supply, and it doesn't matter which one you connect it to. Now coming out of those two 140mm fans in the front of the case will be these two fan connectors. Route them through the top right cutout so that we can connect them to a fan hub. You can find the link to this fan hub and every other part in this build in my description. Coming out of that fan hub will of course be another fan connector. We're going to route this through the back corner cutout right here. And then we'll be plugging it into this top left header right here labeled system fan. It is a bit of a tight squeeze for your hand, but definitely possible to plug it in. Now we're gonna plug in the power cables, starting with this 24-pin power connector. Route it through this top middle cutout and plug it into this big connector on the right side of the motherboard. And if you're having trouble here, do make sure that the 2x2 pin connector on the top goes in before the rest of the connector. Next up, we're going to plug in the CPU power cable. Route this through the top right cutout. And then once again, a pretty tight squeeze, but you can definitely do it. Plug the CPU power cable into this top left connector. Ensure that the connection tabs are facing upwards. Now we're gonna work on the front panel cables. First up is the USB 3.0 cable. This will route through the bottom middle cutout, and it'll be plugging into the connector labeled USB 3.0. Next up would be the USB-C cable. Route it through that same bottom middle cutout, and this will be plugging into the connector to the very right of that USB 3.0 cable we just plugged in. Next, we have the audio connector. This we're going to route through the bottom right cutout and plug into the connector labeled F audio, which is on the very bottom left corner of the motherboard. And now for everyone's favorite cables ever, the front panel cables. Route these through the bottom middle cutout and use this as your guide. Now it's actually not that complicated. For the power and reset switch, it does not matter which you put for the positive or negative side. And those are the only two front panel cables you really need to plug in. And now we're finally going to install the graphics card. Remove these two screws holding the PCI brackets in place and then gently remove them. Push down the PCIe retention tab and then slowly install your graphics card. You should hear a subtle click when it's properly fastened. Then while supporting the graphics card with your hand, reinstall those screws we removed a couple seconds ago. And our last step, we have to make sure that graphics card has some power. So locate that VGA cable coming out of the power supply, route it through the bottom middle cutout, and plug it into the graphics card. Replace all the panels and the PC is officially built. Now let's install Windows and some drivers. To install Windows, you'll want to get a USB drive that is at least 8 GB in size and plug it into another USB device. On that computer, head over to Google, type in Windows 10 ISO, and click the first Microsoft.com link that comes up. You can also find the link to this in my description. Scroll down a tiny bit and click Download Tool Now. When that's downloaded, go ahead and run it. It'll load a little bit, then it'll take you to this page, click Accept, then it'll load a little bit more, and you'll want to click Create Installation Media and click Next. Ensure that it's your language of preference, Windows 10 64-bit, and click USB flash drive, then click Next. Click Next again, and then it'll take a decent bit to install Windows 10 onto this drive. So while that's loading, relax, eat some snacks. When that finishes, plug it into the new PC and boot it up. It will then take you to this screen. Verify that all the info is correct and then click Next. Then click, yep, you guessed it, Install Now. Click I don't have a product key, we'll put that in later. Then click Windows 10 Home or Pro, then click Next. Then read the applicable notices and license terms at least 4 times over, maybe 5, click I accept, and then click Next. And you're gonna select Custom Install Windows Only, ensure that your SSD is selected, then click Next, and now it will officially actually install Windows. Should take less than 5 minutes, then it'll take you to the setup. I don't think I need to walk you guys through this one. And then when you're done with the setup process, it's time to activate Windows. So head over to digitalchillmart.com. From my experience, it's the best website to get Windows 10 license keys for cheap prices. Select Windows 10 Home or Pro, whichever you selected when you were setting up Windows, and then you can use my coupon code RUTECH so you can get a discount at checkout. They give you the activation code immediately upon purchase. So now head to the search bar, search activation settings, and then go to change or enter product key. This is where you'll want to enter in that product key you got from Digital Chill Mart. And now that Windows is activated, let's turn on XMP, which will make sure our RAM is running at the proper speed. Boot up the PC, spam the delete key, and it'll take you to this screen. Next, click this button on the left to activate XMP, go to Advanced Settings, click Settings at the top, click I/O ports, and then to activate Smart Access Memory, enable above 4G decoding and resize bar support. Then go to Save and Exit, and click Yes. And lastly, for the drivers, I will have the links to all of the necessary drivers in my description. Just download them, run them, and then you'll be set. And last but certainly not least, we have the benchmarks. Now, like I said earlier, this is a 1080p machine. For $800, you have a fantastic base computer for when the RX 7000 series and RTX 4000 series graphics cards come out. But in the meantime, what this highly upgradable PC will give you is 1080p gaming exclusively. So yeah, now I'll just play some soothing music. I'll catch you guys in the outro. And that will wrap it up for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like. Have any comments or questions, drop a comment below. And if you enjoy the content that you're seeing, drop a sub. Also, I highly recommend that you go and check out my Discord server. There's a great community there that's very willing to help you out with any PC tech questions you may have. Thanks for watching. Peace out.